Baker Bookhouse. Thanks to everyone who is here in the store, and welcome to everyone watching online as well. My name is Christopher. I work here at Baker. I'm the academic book and file fire here at the store, and we are very excited that you're here, and also that Kelly and Chuck are here. The cafe is going to be open throughout the event, as well as the checkout registers. If you're interested in buying Kelly's book, we asked you, if you're interested in getting it signed, we ask that you purchase it before getting it signed. But the registers will be open throughout the event as well. So I will turn this over to Kelly Kapic and Chuck DeGroat, and we're very excited to have you guys here.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening. Does this crowd do "The Lord be with you"? Yes, thank you for that. We're so grateful to welcome you here. Kelly and I are old friends. We go back 27 years. We began a Greek class in seminary in Orlando 27 years ago.
Wow, I didn't think about that. That's old, man. Can you not bring that up? Wow.
Spent a summer in Oxford, England together, which was a lot of fun. Shortly after that, our wives, the four of us and some friends, were deployed to Quito, Ecuador for the Quito Seminary Project. We were in our mid-20s supposed to go and start a seminary in Quito, Ecuador. Thank the Lord that did not happen.
Quito is thankful. Right?
Quito is thankful. Jesus is thankful.
Yeah.
But it's so great to be reunited with Kelly and to have read this latest book of Kelly, I think number 17. And so it's a privilege to be here. It's also a privilege to have the ghostwriter of the book, Kelly's wife Tabitha, here. Kidding. But
Kitty.
yeah, we've got about 30 minutes for a few questions from me, and then we're going to turn it over to you for about 15 minutes of questions, and that's book signing. Does that sound good? Good. Well, Kelly, I think maybe the most obvious question is, what's behind this book? What inspired it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for coming out. It's cold out there. I know the snow's coming, but there's both some personal and some theological things. On the personal side, some of you who, I wrote a book some years ago called Embodied Hope, and a little bit, although not a lot of the stories in there, but in 2008, Tabitha got cancer, and it was a fairly rare form, and we had two very young children at the time. But anyways, Tabitha and I are pretty driven people, pretty hardworking people, and that kind of brings things to a stop. And in God's grace, after surgeries, she was declared cancer-free. And then in 2010, it's a longer story, but ended up one summer day, her leg not working properly. And from that day, in the summer of 2010 to this day, she deals with pretty serious chronic pain and fatigue. And she looks amazing, and you won't be able to tell, but it's just true. And so part of what has been a process for us is not just dealing with physical suffering, but learning we had to start cutting things out of our lives. And we think, okay, that's enough. And then we're like, no, it's still not enough. And it's part of this book on finitude and discovering our humanity. We don't tend to discover it by thinking about it. It kind of hits us in the face. The other thing that I would say, the other side is when I would go to bed and put my head on the pillow, I would just feel like I'd done enough, just constant kind of guilt. But then the third thing that I haven't really talked much about publicly, and my son was at a recent event and he heard me talk and he asked me afterwards, he said, why didn't you mention this? And he's in college, and I said, well, I don't want to embarrass you and I don't want to draw inappropriate attention. He said, you have my permission because this has been really helpful. Well, so I say that because the book is dedicated to my son, Jonathan, who is 19, and he has pretty serious dyslexia and dysgraphia. And so walking through that with him, school's a nightmare. And so that's part of like, what does it mean to be human, and what assumptions often in an education heavy environment. So those are the personal reasons. And the theological, which I'll just mention passing, are kind of starting to study the humanity of Jesus in the late 90s and the doctrine of creation. And, you know, I'm a Wheaton grad. I went to Reformed Seminary. And it really wasn't until my PhD that I started really thinking, oh, we talk about creation, but I don't think I had a doctrine of creation. The only thing we've reduced that to is, when did God make the earth and how did he do it? Instead of like, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to have bodies that are good? All of that. So those are things I've been thinking about.
What's really cool is I got to read a number of your papers in seminary, and you see some of the themes that show up in his most recent books in his papers back in seminary. Which is astounding. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
This is actually just for us.
we
I'm
feel
just
good.
happy.
We feel good. We hope you feel good. When you talk about being enough, and you ask that question, you have some really good questions in the book that I think everyone can relate to. Am I enough? Am I doing enough? And we live in a kind of production and busyness addicted society, right? You quote Kierkegaard, the result of busyness is that an individual is very seldom permitted to form a heart. And so I imagine you've got some thoughts about the formation of a heart, but yet it seems that the culture offers us these pathways to self-help, time management, be more efficient, things like that. So what's insufficient about a mere time management strategy,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And what might be a better pathway to forming a heart?
Oh, that's a good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll let you. I'll tell you when they're bad. You know, the saying that kind of goes around, you are enough, right? And I actually like that saying. I think it's a good saying. But as an annoying theologian, the more I thought about it, I love the saying, but I think I would say, you're not enough, which is why you are enough. In other words, I really had to kind of get to the point of realizing the reason why I'm enough is because I was never expected to be more than what I am. But I had to really kind of work through that. And I do think there are these extremes pushing us. Probably like everyone here tonight, deeply concerned with issues of kind of racial injustice and other kind of poverty alleviation is something that our family cares a lot about and is involved in just so many important issues. But because of that work, we often also see both in ourselves and in others just complete burnout. And one of the things, fun to talk about sometime, but one of the things I've also discovered is that people who are heavy devoting themselves to good and important causes are often some of the most self-righteous, angry people you'll ever meet. And they're actually looking sometimes to the thing to give what it was never meant to give. And so rather than love, it's actually using the thing. And so, and then I see on the other side, in reaction to the burnout, people like, none of this matters. Maybe racial injustice isn't such a big deal. Maybe the Me Too movement's over, those kind of things. No, they really matter. And we really need to pay attention, but I don't personally have to do everything. And it was important for me to realize something can be really important and really important to God and not be consuming all of my time and energy, because I only have so much time and energy. So kind of working through that, and the kind of short answer is, rather than time management, which is very self-focused. My wife and I love planning and mapping out day, we kind of do all of that, but I really think a higher valuing of community, so I can delight when other people are doing what I can't, and I can see the way I'm interrelated with others. I think that's been a kind of a healthy corrective.
We didn't talk about this, but Saint Teresa of Avila talks about, I think at the end of the interior castle, don't be exhausted by impossible efforts. It's enough to just simply minister and pray for those nearest to you. And there's something for me that's deeply relieving about that, given the fact that it's a much different world than it was when you and I were in seminary, and now we bear witness through social media, through TV, all these different means to all the different injustices around the world. And sometimes our hearts are tugged, like, I've got to take care of it all, right? So,
yeah, it's interesting. I was even thinking about this morning. You know, there's a sense it's an eschatological crisis because there are non-Christians writing about this who, you know, Oliver Berkman's an example, who were really into time management and see the flaw. But part of what's interesting is he and others have talked about the danger of hope, because hope makes you think, in order for this to be meaningful, you have to be able to change it all. And so there's this almost like just appreciate you can't and move on. But it's from a Christian perspective, we really do cultivate hope, but it doesn't have to just be in our time. It's that tension of kind of the now and not yet. And we were quick to talk about, Jesus brought in the kingdom, it's now and not yet. But you know, I think that's worth teasing out some of the tensions we feel. And if God is comfortable slowly working through this, some of it's related to God's comfort with process and some of those questions.
Yeah, that's right. I sometimes talk about the missing attribute of God. We've got all these different attributes. You and I we memorized the Westminster Short Catechism back in the day, if you remember that. God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, unchangeable, in his being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth.
That's good.
But we don't. Well, there's no love in there, first of all. But the second one is God is secure. God is secure, and God is not impatient.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole chapter on process. Are we in a rush? The question Kelly asks is, why doesn't God instantly change me? Which doesn't that feel like a very relevant question? Why didn't God instantly change me? We were probably asking that in our 20s. I certainly thought that when I turned 40, there would be this sense of like an aha. Maybe I've finally arrived, and now post 50, there's very much a sense that I'm just in a game of chutes and ladders here, you know, and you sort of get to the top and talk a little bit about the process and the patience of God and the patience that we're invited to.
I won't tell you it's a good question, but it's a good question. You know, it's interesting. I really love how you introduced it in terms of God and his security. When we were like going through cancer, I found praying very difficult. And you never know until you go through it, like, will you be angry? Will you be this? One of the things I was surprised at is the only prayer that would come out for me often, which I didn't plan, just would come out regularly, is, God, I'm thankful I'm not you. And because I'm too tired, and if you need my prayers to do stuff, ain't nothing gonna happen. And so I'm glad that you're God and I'm not. And part of what's been important to realize, God's actually very comfortable being God, and he's very comfortable with us not being God. And it's the classic creator-creature distinction. In some ways, this book is just a long pastoral reflection on the goodness of the difference between God being God and us being humans. And just kind of learning that God is comfortable. And so part of the whole process thing, I'm with you. I think we both kind of, you think you're just going to get better and stronger, and it doesn't happen physically. It doesn't happen these other ways. So anyways, trying to think about God and process. And one of the things that has become important to me is to realize God's super comfortable with process. It gets back to the doctrine of creation, where God could have made everything like that. I mean, he could make it, doesn't matter if you think the Earth is 4 trillion years old, or I don't know, 10,000, whatever the other option is.
Well, let's not get into those issues tonight.
Exactly. The point is, it's not relevant either way. God, day after day after day, he likes to do things through process. And I realized I would constantly feel like God's just disappointed with me. And it's only when I realized, no, God's not freaking out about process. He's the one who, the creator is the recreator. And so he's comfortable moving Kelly, moving his people, moving his church slowly along, moving us somewhere. And so coming to believe that God's actually comfortable with process has really helped me to be more comfortable with it myself.
Thank you.
I can't tell the sarcasm. I'm used to us, you know.
So you have another chapter, I think it's called How Do We Misunderstand Humility? And so this feels like another really important question for our cultural moment. I think one of the things that I've observed in Kelly over the years, over the course of 20 plus years, is a kind of humility in the work that you do when theologians are doubling down during these polarizing conversations. It feels like we're at war. And you, from a tradition and with convictions, have been able to remain connected to people who you disagree with and model curiosity and humility. Talk to us a little bit about what you learned in your study and your research and in your own life about humility.
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because one of the most exciting parts for me, one of the most helpful things was, as I was thinking about what does it mean to be human, and I started reflecting on humility, and I've written some on humility before, but really digging in and in the tradition, Augustine and the Desert Fathers and Aquinas, but I remember I was working at a Starbucks one day, and I do think profound things, to be profound, they often end up being very, very simple. And I'll never forget, I've been working on it for a long time, when it hit me. And I thought, we have so often misunderstood humility because we've grounded humility on sin. And we've said the reason you should be humble is because you're a sinner. And once I realized, I'm a Reformed theologian. It's Grand Rapids, so you know what that means. A lot of times when I'm in places, they don't. But anyways, so I don't doubt that we're sinners, and the fact that we are sinners can contribute to the fact that we should be humble. But if you try and build the idea of humility on that, it's where we get a lot of self-loathing and self-hatred and deep, and I deal with that with students on a regular basis. And then realizing, no. The fact that we're creatures is why we should be humble. That even if there was no sin and fall, we were just made to be humble because we were made to depend upon God, on each other, and the earth. And that dependence was part of the good of creation. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer has a great reflection on this where he says, basically, that kind of dependence isn't the fall. The fall is what distorts all of this. So that now because we are dependent on each other in light of sin, now your dependence on me and mine on you, I see as a threat. So I either want to ignore you or dominate. And so I think that's constantly there. But if you see just being a creature means humility, then it means we don't just ask, I'm sorry, but how do you do this? Do you have an answer? And so anyway, now sin makes all of that more complicated, but to your question on, being someone with a tradition, having convictions, it's kind of like, I think, we really struggle to understand toleration in our day. And even as I was thinking about this, toleration and listening, we really don't think you're listening or you're tolerant unless you 100% agree with me. But you can be a very good listener and not 100% agree. And what tends to happen is if you are required to 100% agree, you're probably not really listening. It's just an echo chamber because you're just listening for what is agreement. So for me, listening has become very important. And as you know, this is my wife and I sometimes encourage young couples to think about this. It's super uncomfortable, but when you go out to dinner with someone or you're sitting down with someone, pay attention to how often they ask you questions. It's so rare. We'll have a dinner for 2 hours with someone and they leave thinking it was a great dinner and literally not one question was asked. And there's different personalities, but I do think, being genuinely curious, listening has become important. We can follow up on that if you want. I just kind of wandered around.
I was just thinking we went out to dinner last night.
You asked great questions. You guys are awesome.
Well, and this is what's so helpful about your book, because you are a Reformed theologian you're reframing things that I think some of us who grew up in the Reformed traditions sort of taken for granted. But we didn't talk about this in advance, but I was thinking Lent is coming, right? And as a pastor for a number of years, maybe I often say my favorite liturgical day of the year was Ash Wednesday, because I got to impose ashes. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. And that was good news. That is good news.
Yeah.
That isn't, you're the scum of the earth, you're bad, there's something deeply wrong, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Which part, that, I think it is good news that you're dust.
Well, yeah, it's good news, but it's not sending some sort of message that you're as bad as you could be.
Right, yes.
Being human is not bad news.
Yeah.
Right?
No, and I do think actually, and a lot of people I've talked to who, after an Ash Wednesday service, for example, will talk about how powerful it is because it is one of those reorienting events. This is why the Christian calendar matters, right? Like, I don't have to keep striving like this. I've only got 70 years and 10, maybe a little more, maybe less. And just the power of that. And for me, in the book, one of the areas to explore was just the birth of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, the womb of Mary, these kind of, the very earthiness of Jesus is startling. And so the humanity of Jesus has been very important to me. And the fact that we're so uncomfortable with it is a sign of how uncomfortable we are with our own humanity.
There's another piece that we didn't talk about, but I'm thinking back to back when I was in college, we had to read Calvin's Institutes cover to cover. That was a really big deal because it sounded a lot different than some of the Reformed soteriology that I'd gotten. And there's a story that maybe it's more of a parable that Calvin tells that you probably remember, where he says, suppose you're walking down the road, and I'm gonna get this completely right, but you see someone laying there, they've obviously done some things to get themselves into a mess. Show pity to them, not for their sake, but because of the image of God in them. Because of that image, they're worthy of giving yourself and all your possessions, I think is what Calvin says. And it's a matter of justice, actually. Is John Calvin, does that sound familiar to some of you? Is John Calvin looking upon the image of God in someone? And so you tell the story in the book of a kind of distorted doctrine of sin, of the atonement, where God can't look upon you, right? God must look upon Jesus, because to look upon you would be be looking upon sin. He said, we've got it all wrong. I felt like that was really powerful. And it was a invitation to God's compassion in a new way. Just talk about that as a Reformed theologian. How are you teasing these things out when you know you're probably shadow boxing with some folks who say you're weak on sin, or it's just too nice?
Yeah. It's hard for me not to say good question. It's an okay question. Yeah, because and I hope pastors and counselors and others who have talked exactly that way won't be angry, but will be. I'm not, anyways. So I know I've often heard, listen, super bad sinner, which is true, but don't worry, the Father doesn't look at you, he looks at Christ. So he sees Christ, not your sin, which is a huge comfort and grace, and there's truth to that. But at some point in the Christian life, it's legitimate to ask, well, wait a minute, if he only sees Christ, does he even love me? Because we tell people that God loves you, but maybe he actually the Father just loves the Son and he hates you. And I see this show up a lot because we have kind of the Father linked with wrath, and the Son is the loving one, which creates all kinds of problems. And then realize, no, the Father so loved, he sent the Son and pours out the Spirit. That's the coming of the Son and the Spirit are not what make the Father love us, but the fruit of the Father's love for us. And to realize, it's actually just a good Trinitarian understanding that God is not, the persons aren't pitted against one another. And I think that started to help me realize it gets related to do we all have to be the same? What happens? Or even just, God can't be, the holy God can't be in the presence of sin, which is talked about more in there, and realizing, I understand the text where people are getting that from, but without realizing it, we're making sin have leverage over God. And all of a sudden, if God can't be in the presence of sin, one of the great promises is though the Holy Spirit dwells in us. And you wonder, how is that? And Jesus walked among sinners. And, so there are actually some pretty fundamental questions to ask. Because the surprise is, yeah, in a sense, God can be in the presence of sin, but the way he deals with it is not by running from it, but by coming in to purify and to draw to himself, right? So anyway.
It begins in Genesis chapter 3. God moves toward Adam and Eve in their sin, covered in fig leaves. Where are you? Right?
That's great. That's really good.
That's where the gospel begins. We don't even have to wait until Jesus, right? Over and over, it seems like God keeps coming near and near tabernacle, temple, Jesus, Spirit. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, and the goal is not to there's a chapter or a section of a chapter where I explore kind of Galatians 2:20, been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but the life I live by faith. And one of the things I realized is we talk about dying to self and being crucified, which is all true. But what does that mean about my personality? Right? What is that? And to realize, no, I still live. The goal of Christian life is it's not because God hates you, he loves you, and he doesn't love what sin is doing to hurt you and others. So he's not an angry, taskmaster. He's trying to free his children to experience shalom and to participate in it. And it's just a different way of thinking about his dealing with our sin.
So good. I remember all the way back to seminary, union and communion with God was so central to what you were writing. And it's been so central through 17 books. Can you imagine that? And they're all really good. But I'm mindful.
There's a lot of editing in there. So.
Yeah. Well,
that's right.
So, hey, I'm mindful of our time. It's 7:30, and we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask questions. So, I'm sure not all of these folks have read the book.
Probably no one.
But you've got a globally acclaimed theologian before you right now. So, what are your questions? Yeah, just maybe speak loud, or I can repeat it.
So I actually have read the book.
Yes.
So
way to go, you win.
I mean, yeah, okay, kind of cheated, but so thanks for the book. I really appreciate it. It felt like a big, long pastoral conversation. I was curious. I know it's not a systematic treatment of finitude in sort of every aspect of Christian theology, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the eschatological dimension of finitude. Like sometimes we might get the idea that we shed all that. So yeah, I think that might be a common understanding.
Yeah, thanks. So the question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, is just that's a good question. That's actually a good question. Mediocre question, good question. In case people didn't hear, he's just asking, what about the eschatological reality of finitude and being in glory, or however we want to put it? And I think, yeah, part of the beauty is to realize, no, it's still finite, right? So I think one of the big hurdles for me as an author, I realized on this project early on, is when I say finitude, first of all, it's a fancy philosophical word, so we don't use it a lot. But even those who have heard it before immediately think death. And if you look it up in Oxford, it really just means having limits in terms of time, space, knowledge, power, etc. And death can be part of it, but is not required. And so it's a fancy way of saying the word creature. And so as you work through that, I think, yeah, even in glory, we're creatures. And it gets back to your great point. God is comfortable being God, and we have all eternity to get comfortable being creatures. This is not like a tragic time we just got to get through, and then we're no longer creatures. He really, really likes what he made, and he doesn't like how sin is destroying it, so he is gonna renew it and remake what he's made. But it's great, because I think, so we are still going to learn in glory. We're still gonna work in glory, right? These things, but it's good. It's relational rather than antagonistic. I think.
We have all eternity to become comfortable being creatures.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yes. Yeah.
If anyone's on Twitter right now, that's really good, Kelly. More questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I know you have written several books which are highly academic on John Owen and the Puritans and related. Now then, some more your more recent books are more. I don't want to say practical, but I guess they are. But more, you're trying to make those studies you have made, more accessible. How do you relate? And how have you converged those studies you made from these great minds and theologians into a form that is accessible to us today?
Thank you for asking that. That's very meaningful to me. I think I've always wanted to do that kind of work, and I've done some of it on and off through the years. Chuck and I were talking. He's super old. He's 50, but I turned 50 this year. And sorry, I just outed you. But maybe yours did. But anyways, I've realized I think I'm finally growing more comfortable with my voice. Even my PhD was to study John Owen's theology, because you can't critique me. I'm just telling you what John Owen said, right? It's a way of hiding a little bit. And there's no one I've learned more from than John Owen. And I've said this in print, I don't know if we'd be good friends, actually. I don't know if we'd hang out at the pub much, but I've learned a tremendous amount from him and am deeply in his debt and remain learning from him. But I live in a weird space, so this is very meaningful to me that you would ask that, because I feel like this book and The God Who Gives and some others I've done, I'm actually trying to create a little bit of a different space where I feel like laity will think it's a little too academic in there, because there's Thomas Aquinas in here and Soren Kierkegaard and others, and scholars will feel like, I wish there weren't so many stories. But honestly, my hope is that laity will think, there's enough, I'm going to keep going and I want to learn from this. And scholars will recognize he's not showing all this mood, but he really thought a lot about each of these, and he's not showing all of the play. And that for me would be the ideal. That's what I'm trying to do, is to create a bit of a different space that's not, that's what I'm trying to do. So we'll see together whether or not it works.
I think Embodied Hope does that too.
Yeah, Embodied Hope was that kind of attempt, and it's just, but you know what I found? Someone was talking about high schoolers recently and said something to the effect of youth pastors, stop patronizing your high schoolers. They're learning chemistry. They're learning, all of these things. Don't act like they can't handle any theology. Let's not patronize laity either. Let's not make it that to be spiritual you have to know academic theology. Definitely don't think that. But we can think hard thoughts,
Jason.
We never actually met. I went to RTS too, but I think I was a few years behind you. So you guys really talked about this quite a bit. But kind of one of the phrases that stuck in my mind as you guys were talking was, I've heard plenty of times, of course you're not enough, but Jesus is enough. And that's kind of the point. And I feel like you're taking this in a bit of a different direction. And so where does Jesus' humanity tie in? But you're going, kind of talk about that difference.
That's great. So if you didn't hear what he said, he just said, sometimes people say you're not enough, but Jesus is enough, which is true, right? In a very real sense, that's true. But you're right. It's not what I'm saying, even though it's it's a little like my concern about union with Christ language. As a theologian, I really do believe that central to a healthy understanding of the Christian life is understanding that we're united to Christ, right? And he is our righteousness, he is, you know, all of that. But I've now seen it weaponized in our day, where as soon as someone has an issue, we say, what your identity is in Christ. It's not in this, it's not that you're an Asian American Christian, your identity is in Christ. And I think, well, that's actually a tricky way, because you don't really, it tends to be people who look like me, who are white males, saying that, not knowing that you're in dominant culture and that people like me are smuggling in all kinds of things. And then we're saying, those aren't my identity is in Christ because I have all these other things, but no one's calling it out, right? So it's a similar kind of thing where I want to say, our identity in Christ is the most important thing because it relativizes all other identities, but it doesn't make all other identities unimportant. And when it comes to the question in terms of you are not enough, Jesus is enough, that's true, but actually it's where I think in evangelicalism, in some reform circles, when we disconnect redemption from creation, that's all we can say. But if we have a strong view of creation, we say, no, you're not enough and you were never meant to be. Even if, like you were talking about with Genesis, right? Even before the coming of the incarnate Son, none of us were ever meant to be enough, which is why we always were enough. And so it is, I'm trying to draw on the creation account and then draw on Christ and the significance of his humanity in a different kind of way.
I kind of like to think if Eden was the first temple, then there's the tabernacle, the temple, of course, Jesus comes, the tabernacle, we are the new temples. Saint Teresa of Avila, my favorite 16th century reformer, says, your soul is a garden in which God takes great delight. I love that. God sees you, sees right through to the core of who you are. I'm a therapist too. And people will come in with all kinds of pain, right? And some of it's really ugly. But what keeps me in it sometimes is seeing that there's more to you, there's more to your story. There's a lot in the way, but part of my job is to remove every obstacle, to help remove every obstacle to union with Jesus. You know, I'm not, of course, not doing that on my own, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot in the way of that image.
I love that image because God delighting in the garden, because any gardener will tell you it's not, you don't just get a garden needs tending.
Yes.
And weeds need to be pulled out, but also you get to just enjoy where things are growing and so I love that. I think that is a healthy view of process and what God's doing. That's good.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank them for coming out.
We have time for maybe one or two more questions. I was just thanking you for checking my theology.
I didn't.
Yeah, Sean.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how does getting in touch with our humanity play out in our relationships with others in the church and in the world? How do you see that connection coming about?
Yeah, it's just so people here, how does getting in touch with our own humanity maybe connect with our relationship with others and those kind of things? It's a really thoughtful kind of way to, now I catch myself every time, but that's a great question. You know, so Chuck and I had a professor named Steve Brown. Some of you have heard Steve Brown, radio voice, and he's written a bunch of books. But Steve Brown had this quip one time I heard him say that I really liked and has become important in my life, where he said, you can only love to the degree that you've been loved, which I think is very true and helpful. And I think it's kind of related to your, it's like it just turned on. It's kind of related to your question. I think you can only appreciate other people's humanity to the degree that you have started to understand your own humanity. And one of the things we constantly do with others is we're just not happy that they're human. right? And you know, I was reading something recently, it was talking about, you know, after the first 18 months of partners, relationship or marriage, you know, some of the biological things wear off and you have this, and then all of a sudden, 2 or 3 years down the road, you're like, I married the wrong person, right? And it's kind of like, you did, because it's another human being. And you're starting to discover the reality of their humanity and their sin. And we love to imagine that there is someone else who doesn't have that. And one of the things that's become important to me is just kind of at a visceral level, I reject romanticism in terms of romantic ideas of community, romantic ideas of spirituality, because I've been hurt by them and I think others are. And so I'm really against romantic views of what it means to be human. And so I think becoming more in touch with your humanity actually opens up a way for you to be really compassionate, present with other people, and not just view them as a means to something.
That requires some honesty with yourself,
Mm.
right? Some vulnerability, looking at your own life, looking at your own stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you know, like vulnerability is the rage, and I have a section talking about vulnerability. But it's all it really is just trying to get all of us to realize what's true, right? That it's not that we become vulnerable, we just are vulnerable, right? That's what it is to be a creature. And Kurt Thompson has great discussions about this, you know, it is, and in some ways, that's my book is just trying to say, hey guys, this is what's really going on. And we would be healthier and we would be more liberated and more calm if we realized it. We come to terms with, let's lay down some of these myths so that we can create space to actually love. And one of the things that's become clear to me, and I love efficiency and I love productivity, but I really see them now often as the enemies of love.
Mm.
And so, yeah, because they're very inhumane so much at the time.
Well, it's a very compassionate book. It's a thoughtful book. It's a wise book. And that's how I've known you for 25 years, to be honest.
Mm.
Yeah, so thank you. Thank you for the friendship. Thank you for your work. Thank you for coming out tonight. You'll have some time to interact with Kelly after this. He'll sign your books, I believe, if you want him to do that. But can we give Kelly a hand?
Thank you.